My colleagues and I, and many others on our side of the aisle, often talk about MAGA as being like a cult. And we've spent a lot of time on this podcast over the last almost 6 years unpacking how the energy that animates MAGA is really feeding off of a conspiracy theory style of propaganda. And that style of propaganda is dangerously close to authoritarianism and fascism, ultranationalism. The reason for this is it generates a lot of intense emotional animosity toward a perceived enemy, toward a set of scapegoats. And it moves political discourse beyond evidence, beyond facts, into hearsay, into outrageous stories about how bad the other side is, into making all kinds of linkages about what the problem is and who's causing the problem, and therefore various types of actually quite brutal and bigoted solutions. When you take all of that conspiracy-driven animosity and then you supercharge it with religious fundamentalism that creates a picture of a cosmic battle between good and evil, you have a lot of what's going on today. And we saw that in full display, in living color at the Charlie Kirk Memorial. In this time of the algorithm continuously flooding us with all sorts of information and content and opinions that tend to reinforce what we already believe and tend to actually, as the data shows, radicalize us further and further to the fringes of those particular ideologies. I think it's good to be on the alert for how across the spectrum we could be susceptible to similar kinds of dynamics, even though they're not as god-awful as what MAGA is doing. So for me personally, when I try to learn and think and form my opinions on these kinds of topics, I tend to look for data. So Pew Research in 2021 published this study. It's something they call the Political Typology Beyond Red and Blue, where they really try to break down in granularity the political spectrum of different opinions that people hold and what percentage of the population really holds those positions. Now, this was done by surveying over 10,000 people in depth. And it's actually the 8th version of this particular study, the 8th wave of research that they've done since 1987 on trying to map out the political spectrum within America. And when I first interacted with this data, I was surprised by something. So when you look left of center, what you find is that the establishment liberals and the Democratic mainstays make up about 29% of the overall population. And if you go and read the study, it is many, many pages long, and they have detailed breakdowns of these different categories and what the positions are and how they contrast with one another. But when we look right of center, we find that the farthest right categories, the faith and flag conservatives, the committed conservatives, and the populist right, which is what people like Steve Bannon have energized and exploited, make up 28% of the American population. I think it's pretty safe to say that this is the coalition that wins the 2 elections that Trump has won. Now, personally, I identify as a progressive. And so when I look at this chart and I see that progressives in the United States make up just 6% of the overall population, that was flabbergasting. I would have thought it was about 20%, maybe 15%. If you had told me it was 10%, I would have said, wow, that's way less than I thought. It's actually 6%. And if you go down the line on progressive policies, on social justice policies, on what you would think of as a progressive agenda, those are our people. And that's how small our group actually is. So I think these are really sobering numbers in terms of the question, how do Democrats start winning elections again? Because there's something else about this particular spectrum that is fascinating to me. In the middle of the spectrum, you have these 3 groups: stressed sideliners, the ambivalent right, and the outsider left. And if you go and read the study, these are people who tend to be movable, right? This is the reality of our election map. Most of the states, most of the counties are decided ahead of time because people are locked into their particular voting habits and loyalties. But there's a group who tend to float. And the really difficult thing about this is that they're low information voters. The really difficult thing about this is that they are not political junkies. They're not tapped into everything. They don't understand everything about politics. They're not following the policies. All they get are the sound bites and the vibes. And that's really, really difficult because it's awful to think that somehow politicians have to play to this group of movable voters in order to decide where the electoral map ends up. Those three groups together make up about 37% of the population. Many of them don't vote. Some of them can be persuaded to vote either way. And the thing I want to suggest to you here is that the right-wing propagandists have done two things better than what we've been able to do left of center. They've been able to set aside differences and form coalitions that can all pull in the same direction. And they've been able, criticize it as much as we do, they've been able to figure out how to talk to that 37% that's movable in ways that make the left seem unpalatable and make them seem like the reasonable option. We know within our circles that's crazy, but this is the reality of what has gone on within our political discourse. So for me, the really big questions is how we as progressives figure out how to build coalitions that can all pull in the same direction and figure out how to craft our messaging and focus on the issues and use the kind of language that will speak to the people who are movable, who end up deciding elections in swing states in this country.